The sun had long since set, casting the sky in hues of purple and orange as the lawyer's car glided down the empty road he had driven countless times before, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife through silk. It had been a grueling day in the courtroom, but now all he wanted was to get home and unwind, to forget about the long arguments, the sharp words, and the weight of the cases he'd carried that day. It had been an especially tiring week, and as the familiar street signs passed by, he couldn't help but feel relief that the end of his shift was near. He leaned back in his seat, a soft sigh escaping his lips as he turned the music down just a little to let the quiet of the night take over. The drive felt routine. Every corner, every turn was mapped out in his memory, and he was almost there. He had taken this route dozens of times. The streetlights flickering in the distance seemed like a welcoming beacon, pulling him closer to the comfort of his apartment and his bed. He adjusted the rearview mirror as his thoughts drifted away from work to the more personal things he would enjoy once home. The rest he needed: the warm food waiting in his fridge, maybe even a good book before sleep. That was when the blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it was just another car, but then they blinked again, and his heart skipped a beat. It wasn't another car at all, but a police vehicle signaling for him to pull over. He looked to his side, glancing at the empty road and the quiet surroundings, unsure of why he had been flagged down. There hadn't been anything unusual about his driving or his speed. Had he missed something? He pulled over anyway, as he had done countless times before in moments like this. But something felt different in the air this time. He could feel it before the officer even approached the car. He slowed his breathing, keeping his hands on the steering wheel. Just as his driver's training had taught him, his palms began to sweat slightly, though his fingers remained steady. He glanced in the rearview mirror once more, but all he could see was the officer's shadow as they moved toward him. The car's headlights made the officer's form loom large and imposing as they stepped closer with purpose. He told himself to remain calm as he watched the officer approach his window through the side mirror. The officer didn't say anything at first, just stood there staring at him through the glass. The lawyer could feel the weight of the silence pressing in around him as his mind raced, trying to think through the situation. He rolled down the window slightly enough for the officer to speak, but he wasn't sure what to expect. He could already tell from the officer's posture that something was wrong. The way they moved their hand near the holster at their side, their eyes scanning his face with a strange intensity. He had been through traffic stops before, he had even interacted with officers during his years of law school, but this felt different. He tried to meet the officer's gaze calmly, but the tension in the air was palpable and thick enough to cut with a knife. The officer leaned in slightly and asked for his license and registration in a tone that seemed more demanding than normal. It wasn't a question, it was an order, his eyes never leaving the lawyer's face. The lawyer's heart began to race, his mind suddenly filled with uncertainty. He was sure he had done nothing wrong. His paperwork was in order, his driving had been steady, there was no reason to be pulled over. But something about the officer's cold stare made him feel as though he were guilty of something without knowing what that something was. He handed over his license and registration, trying to keep his voice, even when he asked if there had been any issue with his driving, but the officer just shook his head without answering and motioned for him to step out of the car. The lawyer's heart skipped a beat. He hesitated, his mind spinning with confusion and dread. Why was he being asked to step out of the vehicle? He hadn't done anything wrong. Was this a routine stop, or was something else happening? He looked around, but the empty street provided no answers, and the officer's firm stance left no room for negotiation. So he did as instructed, opening the car door slowly and stepping out of the vehicle, keeping his hands visible. The cold night air hit him immediately as he stepped out of the car, his feet touching the asphalt with a soft thud. The streetlights above cast a harsh glow across the empty road, and the officer's presence felt like a shadow looming over him. The lawyer stood there trying to maintain composure, but his nerves were starting to show. His mind raced with questions. He had never been pulled over in such a manner before, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong as the officer circled around him, his eyes scanning every movement like a predator eyeing its prey. The officer was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in full uniform. His face was stern and unreadable, not a hint of warmth or understanding in his expression. The lawyer tried to meet the officer's gaze, but it felt impossible, like he was looking through him. Rather than at him, he stood still, trying to keep his posture confident, but the unease growing within him was becoming impossible to ignore. The officer spoke then, his voice cutting through the silence in sharp tones, demanding to know if he had been drinking or using drugs. The lawyer froze for a moment, taken aback by the sudden accusation. There had been no signs, no erratic driving, no sudden movements, just a simple drive home after a long day in court. He had done nothing to warrant such a question, and yet here it was thrown at him like an accusation that carried the weight of guilt without cause. He immediately answered, "No, I have not been drinking. I've had nothing to drink at all. And I'm not under the influence." But the officer didn't seem to care. His eyes narrowed suspiciously, and his next words were even more blunt and accusing. "You're slurring your speech. You look like you've been drinking." The lawyer's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The officer hadn't even observed anything about his driving or his demeanor that could warrant such an accusation. This was no longer about a routine traffic stop. This was about something deeper, something far more personal. The lawyer tried to explain himself again. "No, I'm just tired from work. I'm a lawyer. I've been in court all day. I'm not drunk." But the officer interrupted him with a raised hand, as if dismissing his explanation. Without a second thought, the officer then demanded that he perform a field sobriety test. Right there on the side of the road, the lawyer's frustration bubbled up inside him. But he kept his voice steady, remaining as polite as possible. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, but the officer wasn't listening. His mind seemed made up. At this point, the lawyer knew that arguing would get him nowhere, and that the best course of action was to comply, even if it felt humiliating. He wanted to get through this without making the situation worse, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about the law anymore. It wasn't about his supposed impairment. It was about something more insidious, something lurking just beneath the surface, something that had nothing to do with his actions, but everything to do with who he was and what he represented. As he stood there performing the test as instructed, he could feel the eyes of the officer on him, every movement scrutinized, every step watched with a judgmental gaze. His heart raced faster now with every word, every action from the officer. It wasn't just the test that made him uneasy, it was the way he was being treated, as though his innocence was irrelevant. It didn't matter if he was a lawyer, it didn't matter if he was in control of the situation. In the eyes of this officer, he was just another black man on the side of the road, and that alone was enough to be treated like a suspect. The officer didn't seem to care about the results of the test either. When the lawyer completed it with precision and clarity, the officer simply nodded as if it meant nothing and turned away without saying a word. It wasn't until then that the lawyer realized this wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. This was deliberate. This wasn't about the law. It was about the officer's perception of him, and that perception was clouded by something he couldn't control: his race. The officer finally told him he was free to go, but the lawyer stood there for a moment, just staring at the man who had accused him of something he hadn't done. As the officer returned to his car, without a word, the lawyer felt a deep sense of violation, as though his dignity had been stripped away. In an instant he had done nothing wrong, but in that moment he had been made to feel guilty simply for existing on the wrong side of the law, the wrong side of the color line. As the officer returned to his vehicle without another word, the lawyer stood there for a long moment in stunned silence, his mind reeling, trying to process what had just happened. He had followed every instruction, remained calm, answered every question truthfully, yet he was still treated like a criminal. This was supposed to be just another routine stop, but it had turned into an ordeal that left him questioning everything about the system he had worked so hard to be a part of. His legs felt heavy, as if they were made of stone. But somehow he forced himself to move towards his car, each step taking him further away from the officer and closer to a realization that weighed heavily on his soul. He reached his car and sat down, feeling the cold leather of the seat against his back, but the comfort of the car did little to ease the sense of anger and confusion boiling within him. He turned the key in the ignition, and the engine hummed to life, but the sound felt distant, almost as though it were coming from another world. The headlights cut through the dark road, but the familiar streets no longer held the same sense of safety or peace they had earlier that night. As the road stretched ahead of him, his thoughts kept drifting back to the officer's harsh words and cold demeanor, how quickly everything had escalated, how the officer had judged him before he'd even said a word. The accusation of driving under the influence had been completely baseless. There had been no slurred speech, no erratic movements, no sign of impairment at all, yet the officer had insisted on treating him like a criminal, as though the color of his skin had already marked him as guilty. The lawyer had dealt with prejudice before, but never so blatantly, never so openly as he had tonight. It was as if the officer had seen his blackness before anything else had even mattered. And that was the most painful part, because in that moment it wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about a system that had already decided who he was based on nothing more than the way he looked. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he drove, but the anger only made the ache in his chest grow deeper. How could this still be happening in a world where he had worked so hard to prove himself, where he had gone through years of law school, built a career, and earned respect? How could this officer think that he was some sort of criminal just because of his race? He had grown used to subtle racism, the kind that lurked behind closed doors or in offhand comments. But this was different. This was blatant. This was an officer of the law, accusing him of something he had not done, and doing so with the confidence that his actions would never be questioned. As he drove home, the weight of it all settled over him like a heavy fog. He knew he couldn't let this go. He couldn't let this false accusation slide, as if it were just an unfortunate misunderstanding. He had to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their skin color. He thought about his family, his friends, his colleagues, and all the other black people who faced this kind of injustice. Every day he thought about how often people like him were presumed guilty before they were ever given a chance to prove their innocence. The moment he walked through the door of his apartment, he threw his keys on the counter, his mind racing with everything he had just experienced. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, but the sting of what had happened didn't fade away. It lingered like a wound that wouldn't heal. He knew he needed to take action. He couldn't just let this go. But what could he do? How could he make sure that what happened to him didn't happen to someone else? He grabbed his phone and began to write a message to his closest friends explaining what had happened. But even as he typed the words, his hands trembled slightly. He felt a mix of frustration, fear, and something else deep inside, something that told him this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a symptom of something much larger. He decided right then that he would take action. He wasn't sure how or where it would lead, but he knew he had to speak out about what had just occurred. The system had wronged him, and he wasn't going to let it go without a fight. The injustice of the situation burned in his chest, and he knew it wasn't just his battle to fight, but a fight for everyone who had ever been treated as less than because of the color of their skin. The next few days felt like a blur to the lawyer, the incident from that night replaying over and over in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling of powerlessness that had crept over him when the officer had dismissed his words, when he had been made to feel like he wasn't even a person, but just a target, just a suspect. It wasn't just the accusation itself that weighed on him. It was the way it had unfolded. The officer had already decided who he was before he had even spoken his first word. The moment the officer had walked up to the car, the lawyer had felt the tension in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with the stop itself, but everything to do with how he was seen simply because of his skin color. The thought gnawed at him. He found it hard to focus at work, his thoughts constantly drifting back to that night, the way the officer had circled him with suspicion, how he had been asked to step out of the car for no good reason, and how quickly things had escalated from there. The feeling of being judged and accused without cause made his blood boil, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized how familiar it all seemed. How many times had he heard stories like his before? How many times had he witnessed friends and colleagues share their own experiences of being wrongfully accused because of their race? How many times had he seen the same pattern play out again and again? But this time it was different. This time it was him. At the office, his colleagues sensed something was off. They noticed his distant demeanor and the way his sharp focus had started to fade into the background of his mind. Even when he was physically present in meetings, he was mentally miles away, wrestling with the same questions again and again. Had he done enough to protect himself in that moment? Had he said the right things? Had he taken the right steps? Or had he been too compliant, too trusting of the system? that had let him down in such a raw and painful way. It wasn't until he met with his closest friend and fellow attorney later that week that the weight of his thoughts finally came spilling out. He sat across from her at a small cafe down the street from his office, and she could see it in his eyes, the anger, the frustration, the confusion he was trying so hard to keep hidden behind a mask of calm and professionalism. But it was impossible to miss the storm that was brewing inside him. She asked him what had happened, and for the first time since that night he told her everything in a rush of words and emotion: the officer's cold demeanor, the false accusation, the search of his car without cause, everything that had felt so wrong and unjust. She listened without interrupting, her expression serious but compassionate, and when he finished telling the story, she finally spoke. "You know you have to do something about this, right?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. He nodded silently. It had already been on his mind for days, but hearing her say it out loud made the decision feel real. He had to do something. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the bigger picture, the systemic issues that allowed for people like him to be treated this way, with no consequence. He couldn't just let it slide. He couldn't allow his experience to be dismissed as just another unfortunate incident. She was right, he knew it deep down, but it was hard to know where to start. The thought of facing the officer, or even the department in an official capacity, filled him with dread. But he also knew that staying silent would mean letting the system win, letting them continue to act without accountability, without change. It wasn't just about his case. It was about the countless others who had suffered in silence, or been silenced by fear. He had to take action. He had to make his voice heard. That night he sat down with his laptop and began drafting a formal complaint to the police department, detailing the events of the stop and the way he had been treated. He described everything as clearly as he could, from the officer's approach to the false accusations to the way his rights had been disregarded in that moment. He wasn't just writing about his own experience. He was speaking for everyone who had been in his shoes, everyone who had ever felt the sting of injustice at the hands of law enforcement. He was writing not just to make sure that what happened to him was acknowledged, but to ensure that it wouldn't happen to someone else. The words came slowly at first as he carefully chose each one, but eventually they began to flow more freely. He knew this was only the first step in what could be a long and difficult fight, but it was a step that had to be taken if he ever hoped to see any real change. When he finally finished the letter, he sat back and stared at the screen for a moment, uncertain about what would come next. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't stay silent anymore. The time to speak out was now. The next day, after submitting his formal complaint to the police department, the lawyer couldn't shake the sense of unease that lingered in the back of his mind. He had done what he thought was the right thing, but a sense of dread still clung to him like a second skin, as if he had opened a door he couldn't close again. He knew that taking action would likely bring scrutiny his way. But even knowing that didn't make it any easier. He had hoped that by speaking out the truth would come to light. But deep down he couldn't escape the nagging fear that the system would protect its own, and he would be left standing alone. As the days passed, his frustration grew. He spent hours drafting emails, making calls, and trying to reach the right people in the department. But it seemed like nothing was happening. There was no urgency, no real response to the situation he had described. The lack of accountability was suffocating, and it felt like his voice was being drowned out by the bureaucracy that kept his case from moving forward. One afternoon, just a few days after he had filed his complaint, he received a call from his lawyer friend, who had been following up on the matter. She told him that the department had acknowledged his complaint, but only in the most formal of terms. No real apology had been offered, no promise of action had been made. Instead, the department seemed content with their usual response, a simple statement that an internal review would take place, and that they would investigate his claims of misconduct. He knew that meant very little. He had heard these same words countless times before, spoken by officials who had no intention of holding anyone accountable for their actions. But something in his gut told him this was different. This wasn't just another report of racial profiling. This was his story, and he wasn't going to let it slip away unnoticed. A few days after the phone call, as he sat at his desk reviewing case files, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news outlet reaching out for comment. They had caught wind of his story through the grapevine, and wanted to know if he would be willing to speak publicly about his experience. The lawyer hesitated for a moment, but then something inside him clicked. He realized that he couldn't just be a passive participant in his own story anymore. He had to take control of it if he wanted to see change. He agreed to the interview, and within hours he was sitting in front of a camera, speaking into a microphone, telling the world about his experience, the frustration, the anger, the humiliation of being falsely accused of something he hadn't done. He described the officer's cold demeanor, the baseless accusation, the violation of his rights, and the deeply ingrained racism that had colored every interaction he had that night. As he spoke, he could feel the weight of his words settling in the pit of his stomach. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been wrongly accused or wronged in a similar way. As the interview aired and the story spread, he began to see the power of his voice. The flood of messages from people who had experienced the same kind of injustice began to pour in, stories from people of all races and backgrounds, sharing their own encounters with law enforcement, stories that mirrored his own in so many ways. It became clear that this was not just one isolated incident. This was a widespread problem that needed to be addressed. The public support was overwhelming, but it was also terrifying. The lawyer knew that by speaking out he had put a target on his back. The police department wasn't going to let this go quietly, and he could already feel the pressure building as his story made its way through the media. But he couldn't stop now. He had opened a door that led to something bigger than himself, and he knew that it was time to walk through it, no matter what came next. It wasn't just about the police anymore. It was about the system that allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It was about the laws and policies that needed to be reformed, and the society that had to confront the uncomfortable truth that racial profiling and injustice were still alive and well in the systems that were meant to protect people like him. As the lawyer sat in his office that evening with the weight of it all pressing down on him, he realized that he was no longer just a bystander in his own life. He was an active participant in the fight for change. He had taken the first step toward holding the system accountable, and no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he knew that he couldn't turn back now. As the days following his public interview wore on, the lawyer could feel the tension in the air, like a storm building just on the horizon. At first, it was subtle whispers from colleagues at the office asking if he was okay, and if he was sure about pursuing this case to the bitter end. But the questions soon turned into something more insidious as the whispers began to turn into murmurs, and the murmurs into something darker, something more menacing, a quiet but palpable shift in the way people looked at him, as though the very act of standing up for his rights had branded him as a troublemaker, someone who was challenging the status quo, someone who was stirring the pot where it had been left undisturbed for so long. His inbox was flooded with messages, some filled with support from people who had seen his story and felt compelled to reach out. Others were less kind, filled with veiled threats and accusations. Some questioned his integrity, some insinuated that he was exaggerating the situation or making it all up for attention. The ugliness of the internet seemed to reach a fever pitch as his story spread across social media, his every word twisted and turned into something unrecognizable by those who didn't care to listen to the full truth. He tried to push it all out of his mind. He focused on his work. He tried to maintain the professionalism that had earned him respect in his career. But it wasn't easy. It wasn't just the negative messages that were wearing him down. It was the silent hostility he could feel in the office, the way his colleagues started to distance themselves from him, as if his actions had made him radioactive. Suddenly, the water cooler talk had shifted from the usual topics of sports or weekend plans to muted discussions about his case, as if they were all waiting for him to fall or for his fight to be seen as futile. The looks exchanged between his colleagues when he entered a room were not the looks of respect he had once received, but the looks of suspicion and caution. He could feel the weight of it everywhere he went, even at home. It was no longer a place of solace. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from reporters asking for more interviews with people from all corners of the media trying to capitalize on his story. His own family had reached out with concern for his safety, worried about the potential consequences of continuing down this path. But despite the pressure mounting from all sides, He refused to back down. He had come too far to turn back now. But the most difficult part of it all was what came next. As his case gained more media attention, he found himself on the receiving end of an unexpected backlash from the very system he had once trusted. The police department had issued a statement responding to his claims of racial profiling and misconduct. The statement was cold and devoid of any real empathy. They stated that an internal investigation was underway and that they took his allegations seriously, but it was clear from the wording that they were trying to distance themselves from the accusations without admitting any wrongdoing. The department wasn't apologizing. They were simply trying to sweep it under the rug. To make matters worse, a few days later, he received a call from his lawyer friend, informing him that his complaint had been dismissed. The department had found no evidence of misconduct, and they had deemed the officers' actions to be within the bounds of their protocols. It felt like a slap in the face. All the hard work he had put into documenting the incident, all the time he had spent reliving the details of that night, and now it was all for nothing. The department had decided that it was easier to pretend like nothing had happened than to confront the uncomfortable truth that their officers had acted unjustly. He sat there stunned for a moment, holding the phone tightly in his hand. He had expected the backlash, but not like this, not from the very institution that was supposed to hold people accountable. It felt like a betrayal. But it wasn't just about the department anymore. It was about the system at large, the system that refused to see the problem and instead protected its own at all costs. It was the system that had been designed to perpetuate these injustices and to silence the voices of those who dared to speak up. But even in the face of this setback, the lawyer knew he couldn't let it go. He couldn't let them win. Not like this. He had already taken a step forward in this fight, and he wasn't about to turn back now. He would continue to push for justice. No matter how difficult the road ahead would be, he would make sure his voice was heard, no matter how much they tried to shut him down. The fight had only just begun, and he was determined to see it through to the end. The lawyer spent the next several weeks navigating the rising tide of pressure that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The backlash from the police department had shaken him to his core, but it also ignited something deeper within him, a fierce determination to not let this go unnoticed. It had become clear to him that this was no longer just about his personal experience or the events of that night. It was about exposing the deep-rooted issues that allowed these injustices to persist without accountability. He could no longer sit idly by as the system protected itself and ignored the very real consequences of its actions. He threw himself into his work with a renewed sense of purpose. He began reaching out to other attorneys and civil rights organizations that focused on police misconduct and racial profiling. He needed to understand how others had fought similar battles and what resources were available to him in his own fight for justice. The more he researched, the more he realized just how much ground needed to be covered, how much change needed to be made. He was starting to understand that this fight wasn't something that could be won with a single complaint or a single interview. This was a long-term battle, one that required not just legal action, but public advocacy and grassroots support. The lawyer knew he needed to find a way to amplify his voice even further, to make sure his story didn't fade into the background of public discourse. As so many others had before him, he reached out to the media again, offering more detailed accounts of his experience, hoping to keep the conversation alive. He began working with local activists and community leaders to organize public forums where people could share their own experiences with law enforcement. He realized that by bringing others into the conversation, he could help build a movement, a coalition of voices demanding change. At the same time, he continued to face challenges in his own life. The constant media attention had begun to take its toll on his personal relationships. His friends and family were growing increasingly concerned about the risks he was taking, some worried about his safety, some about his career. The pressure was starting to crack the facade of professionalism he had worked so hard to maintain. But the lawyer knew he couldn't stop now. He had come too far, and the cause was too important for him to back down. Despite the strain on his relationships, he couldn't shake the thought that this was bigger than him. It was bigger than his career. It was about all the other people who had been silenced and ignored by a system that refused to acknowledge his flaws. The weight of the situation was always on his mind, but he refused to let it break him. Instead, it pushed him to work harder. He spent sleepless nights drafting petitions and legal documents, coordinating with advocacy groups, and meeting with journalists to ensure his story stayed in the spotlight. But as he worked tirelessly on his fight for justice, something else was happening, a shift in public perception. He began to notice more and more people speaking out against police misconduct, more and more voices joining the conversation. His fight was no longer a solitary one, it was part of a larger movement for change. The turning point came when a major public figure reached out to him offering support. This public figure had faced similar issues with racial profiling and police harassment, and had been speaking out for years about the need for reform. Their endorsement gave the lawyer a renewed sense of validation and strength. It showed him that his fight wasn't in vain, and that there was real momentum behind it. The more people he spoke to, the more he realized that he was not alone, that this was not just an issue affecting him personally, but one that affected countless others who had been subjected to the same kind of unjust treatment. But even with the growing support and momentum, the lawyer knew the road ahead would not be easy. The system was resistant to change. It had been built on a foundation of power and privilege, and challenging that power would require more than just legal arguments or media coverage. It would require a shift in the culture and mindset of society itself. It would require people to recognize the deep injustices that had been allowed to fester for far too long, and to understand that change wasn't just necessary, it was inevitable. As he sat at his desk one evening reviewing his notes and preparing for the next phase of his campaign, he realized that the battle he was fighting wasn't just for him, it was for everyone who had ever been wrongfully accused or unjustly treated simply because of the color of their skin. It was for the countless lives that had been impacted by systemic racism, and for the future where such injustices would no longer be tolerated. He had set out to change the system, and now he knew more than ever that he couldn't stop until that change was realized. The lawyer's thoughts raced as he stood on the side of the road, the cool night air stinging his skin as the officer continued to scrutinize him. The uncertainty of the situation hung heavy in the air. What had started as a routine traffic stop was now becoming something far more complicated. The officer had made no effort to explain why he was being treated with suspicion. There was no reason given for why he had been pulled from his car, or why he was being asked to stand there in the dark and the cold. But the lawyer knew the reason deep down. He had felt it the moment the officer had approached the car. The officer's behavior was not driven by any real suspicion of wrongdoing. It was driven by something else, something more insidious, the assumption that he was guilty simply because of who he was. His mind wandered back to the countless stories he had heard over the years, stories from friends, colleagues, and clients who had experienced the same thing, people who were profiled by law enforcement simply because of their race or appearance, people who had been treated like criminals without cause. And as the lawyer stood there in the cold, knowing that his story was now adding to that long list of injustices, he couldn't help but feel a sense of anger rising within him. It was a quiet anger, a simmering rage that built within him as he realized just how deeply embedded this injustice was in the system. The officer's demand to search his vehicle without explanation only confirmed what the lawyer had already suspected. The officer didn't see him as a person, he saw him as a threat, someone to be treated with suspicion, someone to be controlled and subdued. He had assumed that the lawyer was guilty before even knowing anything about him, and the more he thought about it, the more the lawyer realized that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was part of a larger pattern, a pattern of racial profiling that had affected so many others before him and would continue to affect countless others unless something was done. In the moments that followed, the lawyer knew he had to make a choice. He could comply with the officer's orders and risk further mistreatment, or he could stand up for his rights and challenge the officer's actions. He had spent his life learning the law. He had spent his career fighting for justice. And now was the moment to put that knowledge into action. He knew he couldn't just let this slide. He couldn't be another person who let the system walk all over them. He had to take a stand. With a calm but firm voice, he asked the officer why he was being asked to step out of the car, and why his vehicle was being searched. The officer hesitated for a moment as if surprised by the lawyer's response, but he quickly regained his composure and repeated his demand. The lawyer felt a surge of frustration, but he remained composed. He knew that challenging the officer's authority would be dangerous, but he couldn't back down now. He had to assert his rights, even if it meant escalating the situation. As the exchange continued, the lawyer could feel the tension mounting between them. The officer's attitude became more aggressive, his words more clipped, but the lawyer refused to back down. He knew that this was a fight he had to have, even if the consequences were unclear. He had to make sure that his voice was heard, and that what had happened to him would not go unnoticed. The officer's final words were a blur to the lawyer as he was handed a ticket for a violation he had not committed, a violation that didn't make sense and wasn't grounded in any real law. The officer gave him a cold stare before walking away without another word. The lawyer stood there in stunned silence as he watched the officer's car drive off into the distance. It was in that moment that the lawyer realized something that would shape his next steps. This was not just about him. This was not just about the officer's actions on that night. This was about something much larger than his own experience. This was about the countless others who had been unfairly targeted and subjected to the same kind of treatment. This was about a broken system that had allowed this behavior to continue without consequence, and it was about time that someone took a stand to change it. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew that he couldn't back down now. He had made the decision to speak out, to challenge the system that had failed him and so many others, and no matter how difficult the road ahead would be, he was determined to see it through to the end.